Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. It's the podcast that takes a look behind the scenes of the fantasy football industry through interviews with some of the best in the business. In this episode, I sat down with Scott Connor of Destination Devy and Dynasty Trades in 5. Our conversation included how he found fantasy football, starting out as a baseball fan, the first fantasy football league he was in, joining Toastmasters, his experience with the FFPC, podcasting tips for those new to podcasting, simulation baseball, being a cat person, and much more. Follow Scott on Twitter at CharlesChillFFB. You can find me on Twitter at DKCKasem and the podcast at GetReal_pod. You can find my content with Rotoballer, Fantasy Six Pack, and South Harmon Fantasy Football. And check out SundayDreamersClub.com for some awesome fantasy football inspired t-shirts and sweatshirts. This podcast is a proud member of the DAP Network. And now, here's my chat with Scott Connor on Get Real with Kacey Kasem. It sounds great, but we're going to flow into it right now with Scott Connor. And I just kind of want to talk to you first and foremost. Let's thank you for coming on the show. But now I want to kind of get to know more about you, as do the listeners right now. So let's kind of figure out how you got into sports in the first place. Did you get into sports when you were growing up, and how was that?
Yeah, into sports as a kid. My dad taught me to love sports before I really even have memories. 1.5, 2-year-old videos where I'm hitting a balloon with a paintbrush. I've seen those. I don't obviously remember it because I've heard you don't really remember anything past before you're 3 years old or something like that. But I've seen the videos. My dad was a huge sports nut. My mom was a really good soccer player and softball player, so she was right there. My parents divorced when I was little, so that went their separate ways. But both of them had an influence in terms of playing sports, watching sports. Always had a game on, always had, hey, do you want to go to this game? Even if it's just a local high school game or junior high game, we used to go to those games just to watch the neighbor kids play. Even when I was really little, that was something my dad thought was really important, community and going and actually watching sports. Then that morphs into watching pro sports, watching college sports, playing in elementary school, junior high, high school. My sport was tennis. I played tennis all the way throughout high school. I wasn't quite good enough to play past that, but that was the sport that I really gravitated towards in terms of playing. And then all the other sports you play as a kid. I played soccer, I played football, I played baseball, played basketball, very well-rounded, but average at best. A weekend warrior, I would say, with those. And that, that's the background. When you play sports, you naturally gravitate towards other things. I'm also a game theorist, a very logical person when it comes to math and background in finance and stuff. So you start to merge the gambling and fantasy industry into, you like playing sports. So you put them together and it creates this massive amount of fun that you can have doing a variety of different games. So that's what led me into playing fantasy just recreationally. And then who knew there'd be an actual industry where you can have a platform and a podcast and you can make a little money, etc. So here we are.
Yeah, it's really, really crazy to think that growing up where we are now and what we're able to do with sports and everything is just so awesome to see. When you were growing up, did you have a job that you wanted when you grew up? Was there some kind of special job that you wanted to be when you grew up?
Yeah, a couple of different ones. So I always wanted to be a play-by-play announcer. And that was something from a really early age. I would mute the television and actually watch what was going on and do my own play-by-play as it was going. And you don't realize how hard that is until you try to do it it's easy to do it for one highlight. I used to love watching baseball and do play-by-play. Ground ball to third, fielder picks it up, throws it on to first out. You can get a flow. But then you realize how hard that is to sustain for 3 hours. And then every day, 162 games a year. It is pretty taxing on your voice. But I wanted to do that. And then I also, for some reason, I wanted to be I guess you would call it a garbage person or a trash collector. I'm sure everybody has random dream jobs like that when they're a kid. Like you want to be a fireman so you can ride on the fire truck. You know, I wanted to be a garbage collector so I could just hang on the back of the truck. You ever remember as a kid, like the garbage person would drive by and they're actually hanging on the back of the truck? Like I thought that was so cool that you got to ride on the back of the truck. And now, like, yeah, it's unless it's a good job, it's probably not worth that couple seconds of fun where you get to jump on and jump off of the slowing down and starting up truck. But yeah, those were my two dream jobs until I actually realized like what it would take to actually become one of those, and it wasn't worth it.
All right. I was getting kind of deja vu when you were saying that. I swear somebody else answered the same way with, I wanted to be a garbage collector. Yeah, I wanted to be on the back of the truck. And yeah, I get it. They just drove by a little bit ago. They looked like they were having a good time. So what about when it came to sports? Did you have a favorite player or team or both when you were growing up, whether that be in football or any other sport?
Yeah, I would say for me, I started in baseball. Even my fantasy journey started in baseball. So I was a huge baseball fan growing up. Eric Davis was my favorite player. He was a former Cincinnati Red. Was really good for a short period of time, but had his career shut short. He actually got throat cancer at like 29 years old, and he missed 3.5 years of playing and then came back and played. And it's kind of an inspiring story, but it killed the prime of his career where you were essentially out for, I mean, almost like he had to retire, and then he ended up coming back because he was healthy enough. But he was my favorite player growing up. I'll never forget. My dad took me to, and the only reason we were able to get tickets to it was because the team was extremely bad. But we went to a Cincinnati Bengals Cowboys game back in the 90s when they had the triplets, you know, Emmett, Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin. I know you're a Cowboys fan, but we were able to go see them play live. And they played in Cincinnati, which at the time the Bengals were awful. They were awful most of my childhood. And so you could actually get tickets. You know, you wouldn't have been able to get tickets in a lot of other places, but you could get tickets there. So he's like, you know what, this might be, and it was after they had already won a Super Bowl. So it was like, this could be a once in a lifetime getting to see a championship team in Cincinnati. So he went to that game. It was actually closer than it should have been, given how bad the Bengals were. I think the Cowboys won by like 6 or something like that. But I'll never forget that. That was my first like live experience football wise, pro football wise. And I don't think I appreciated it at the time. Like, I'll be honest now, if you invite me to a NFL game with all the stuff we have going on with fantasy, especially myself, we'll get into that a little more. I'm not really interested in going to NFL games. It's a taxing day, you know. It's an entire day because you're probably tailgating, you're socializing, then you're watching the game. You're getting in and out of traffic and commuting to wherever you need to go. I mean, it is a full day commitment, much more of a commitment than waking up at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern and just sitting there for 3 hours watching NFL pregames and setting all your lineups and all that kind of stuff. Like, to me, that is much more enjoyable than actually going to the games. But I didn't appreciate it back when I went to my first game. And I haven't gone to many NFL games for that reason. Just never have really found it really fun to go live.
No, I totally understand that. I've only gone a few times and I'm like, okay, like this was a good experience, but I don't know if it's something I need to do all the time. So when you watch football now, like if you're watching a game at home or you're spending Sunday watching football, how is watching football with you right now as an adult, where you are now with fantasy and everything? What's that experience like?
Yeah, I'm your typical just kind of neurotic when it comes to watching fantasy. I have a hard time watching a full game straight through. I'll watch my team, but I typically, like I said before, I go way back with my dad. He's been the root of always being there to watch sports with me, regardless of what it is. We'll watch the Olympics. We'll watch boxing. It doesn't matter. We're always there to watch like the competition. And so him and I, you know, I'm blessed to still have him with me, and he's still, you know, able to move around and able to get in and out and stuff. And we'll just go to different spots and park in front of the, you know, neither of us drink really, but we'll just park in front of a bar or get a table, and it's 6 hours of just sitting there. Hopefully it's a place that has, you know, NFL Red Zone or somewhere where they have the Sunday ticket where you can watch all the games, but we'll just go and park, sit there, we're play on our phones, track our fantasy teams. It's a tradition, and I look forward to it every Sunday. So as long as he's still here, that's usually where you're going to find me. The rare occasions I'll just be at home with my wife. We'll watch games when they're on, but it's a lot of just socializing, watching Red Zone, watching my team when it's on, but very, very chill and laid back.
So how did you find fantasy football? What's the story there?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of interesting. I started really heavy into sim baseball. So way back in the late 90s, they had simulation games that were popular before the consoles allowed you to play multiplayer. So back in the late 90s, sim games for the PC, right when kind of the internet was becoming much more popular. You had a lot more users, and so just playing like sim leagues online. And I was huge into baseball. There was a game called Baseball Mogul back in the late 90s, and I would play online leagues with that. And so it's not fantasy because it's simulation, so it's not based on anything that's happening in real life. But it kind of gives you the feel of, okay, you're managing your own teams, right? Like you're drafting, you're setting lineups, etc. And that led naturally into, hey, okay, let's try fantasy baseball. So my first like 3 or 4 years playing fantasy was mid to late 90s, sporting news, salary cap, playing fantasy baseball. Then that obviously morphs into trying other sports, right? Hockey, basketball, and then football. And football, you kind of just settle into, and it continues to get more popular. And then once we get to a point where there's Dynasty, which I started playing Dynasty in like 2012, the easiest to find at the time was football. But really, it started with baseball. That was my first love. I'm very analytical, very logic-minded when it comes to sports. And baseball was very easy to get into that way back in the day. Like Bill James's books and Moneyball and all that kind of stuff. Like I was fascinated with that. But I knew nothing about the analytics in football. And it's still a growing thing. Like it's just really emerged the last 5 years, way behind the baseball scene. But that's where I started, baseball. And then football was just a hobby. And all of a sudden it becomes more, you play in more leagues, and boom, here we are.
So going from playing in a fantasy baseball league to playing in a fantasy football league, what's the biggest difference between the two that you've seen?
Well, if you just go back to the difference in the sports, the one good thing about baseball is the root of baseball is a pitcher throwing to a batter. So it's very much, and that's not a fully individual game, but it's very much based on 1-versus-1 outcomes. Now, there's other factors that come into play, like the ballpark you're playing in, the weather conditions, the defense and all that kind of stuff, the situations. But largely, you can take a lot of data just from a batter's success against these type of pitchers in these type of conditions. It's very easy to isolate. Same with pitchers. You can take those outcomes and you can branch that off into a lot of other numbers that tell you different things. The tough part to grasp about football is, and you've probably seen it too, but there's just so much going on. I mean, there's 22 players on a field, but there's so much more than even 22 players on a field. They're playing, different schemes. They're playing different strategies. The root philosophy of a defense versus an offense can be very different, even though it's 11 on 11 on both sides. So it's very much more difficult. And that's probably why football analytics has taken a lot longer to catch up, because you can't just isolate one thing and say like this quarterback is this, because there's so many variables that go into, well, why? Is it based on their offensive line, their play caller, their weapons behind them, the defenses they're facing, the down and distances that they're facing? Like it's really hard to just take one single thing and say this is exactly what I need to look at to figure out, is this good or is this bad? So as soon as I got into fantasy football, I immediately was looking for a bigger edge, and we'll probably get into the first place that I really found that, but it definitely wasn't rooted in the same analytics that you found in baseball, even back 20 years ago in baseball compared to what football is today.
So when you started playing fantasy football, do you remember what that league was like, whether that be like the settings or like maybe even somebody you drafted? Do you remember that whole time?
Yeah, it was a very basic. There was no such thing as PPR. It was unheard of to have anything but a kicker and a defense. And I think you only started maybe 6 or 7 players. I mean, it was super shallow. 10 teams, start 7, start 8 with a kicker and a defense. There was no fancy scoring. Heck, I remember it being completely out of the box when my friends and I in college, or like late high school, early college. So we're talking maybe 2000, 2001, 2002, somewhere around then. We were sick of just the only league we played on was a standard like Yahoo league or a standard ESPN league. And so when we found like Sporting News, which used to have a salary cap game, that was like, wow, you actually have to budget something to set your lineup. You can't just go after all the best players. But the next thing is you were able to create custom leagues on like Yahoo or ESPN. And we made a deeper league where it was like 10 teams and you could start like 12 players. And that was like, oh my gosh, like look how many players we can start. And we didn't go with the settings that they came with. We actually dialed them back and we made them touchdown only leagues, total points for the season. So just think about that. Think about how different the game would be today if, Casey, all you were doing is going, nothing matters except for how many touchdowns my team can score between week 1 and week 14. And then there's a playoffs. Yards don't matter. Catches don't matter. Nothing matters but touchdowns. Like, how differently would you draft? You would be analyzing teams like, okay, this team's going to score this many touchdowns as a team. This team's only going to score half. So I just remember that being interesting. And you'd look at your score and you'd go, ooh, I lost this week 15-12. That's all it was. Touchdowns. Didn't matter if a player had 200 yards. If they didn't get that goal line carry and the quarterback got it instead, didn't matter. But I remember that was like a rogue idea that we were so excited to like go to school and advertise that we're making this league that's touchdown only. And it was like a complete novelty. Today, that would be like, no one would really even want to do that, I don't think.
Right. I think I've had 1 or 2 people on here who say, oh yeah, I'm still in this this touchdown only league, blah, 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 and all this stuff. Not blah, 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 because it's really interesting to me. I'm like, I can't even imagine playing like that because, we get so spoiled having all this stuff at our fingertips now where we can do this, that. And there's so many different ways to play fantasy now that you don't even think about like going back to the basics. So it's always surprising when people say like, yeah, I played in a league like that. I can't remember.
Are you in a home league that you've been in for a certain amount of time? Because it's hilarious because I've heard people mention this on shows before, that they can't win their home league. You know, they're considered to be an authority or an expert, or they have a platform where people actually listen to them for advice, yet you can't win your home league. I'm going on year 18 of my home league. It started right after I graduated in college, or as my last year in college. It started with a bunch of high school and college friends, and it is year 18. And we've probably it's a 10 team. We actually converted it to Superflex like 6 years ago, which was ahead of its time. Now a lot of home leagues are still 1 QB, but we converted it to Superflex. But this is year 18. I have never won. I've finished second 3 times. I've finished third 3 times. I think 7 of the 10 members are still original members. And they give me a lot of flack. Like, man, you send us your podcasts and your videos, and like we've seen you on TikTok and we've seen you on Twitter. But like, dude, you can't even beat us. Like, how are people paying you for your advice? How are websites paying you for your advice? But you can't beat us. And this is your basic. They don't tune in until August. They only play in 1 league. This is their league. But the return on investment for some of the people in that league compared to me, it's $100 league. I've basically paid my dues and won very little, other than I think the second place prize gets like $200. So do the math. I'm in the hole for my career in that league compared to some of these others. There's one guy that's won 4 times, and I've known him since I was a kid. And he's just like, maybe I should be the one that has a platform. He's a teacher, could really care less about fantasy football other than this league, but he's won year after year. He's won 4 times. And I'm just like, That speaks to the variance and the randomness of the game we play. No matter how good you are, if you're 60% right, you are lapping the field in terms of percentages.
Right on. You're saying that, and it kind of reminds me of my home league too. Like when I first started it, like I won, but then like everybody caught up, and then everybody started winning more and more and more, and I'm over here like middle of the pack, and I get the same stuff. Yeah, you talk about this, you write about this, and then this. Our home league is so crazy, like how things get drafted and who gets taken where and all the other stuff. So I'm like, it's so much, it's so fun because it's so different than what I'm used to playing in. So, you know, uh, really appreciate. I don't want them to think I'm talking trash. I love that league with all my heart. That's what these draft boards are that are behind me. But it is like that. I can't win to save my life, and it's been going on for like 14 years. It's just like, man. So, okay, let's talk about, have you ever done a live draft, or what are your experiences if you have?
Oh, yeah, I've done many, many live drafts. There's no experience like doing a live draft. I have been playing a lot of high stakes FFPC. I play that a lot. This is my 8th year playing, and I have a partner that kind of recruited me. We were in just a random Dynasty league, and he had joined. A friend of his who was his neighbor asked him to join this random $35 IDP Dynasty league that I had been in. And he had never really played it, but his neighbor was like, hey, you like fantasy football. Why don't you join? And he had been somebody that had been playing forever. He had always played high stakes, very, very basic, but played in places where I had no clue even existed. So we got in this league, and I would be pretty active in the chats. Back then we used to use like Slack and GroupMe, and you have these chats. And he just hit me up one day, and he's like, yeah, I've been paying attention to, what you've been saying, and I like how you built your team. This was back in 2017. And so he's like, do you want to play, or do you want to try playing in these other leagues? And I knew nothing about it. But he had a partner that had to step away for some reason. And he's like, I'm looking for another partner. So we start talking, and, he said he knew immediately when he told me how much the leagues cost to get in. And I didn't back away from like, oh, that's a lot of money, but I'm just like, okay, well, if it costs $2,000 to buy a team, how much do you win? If you win? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, that's a lot, but how much do you actually win? And he always says, as soon as you responded that way, like that was one of those like tests that people put you to. Yeah. That if you go, oh, I can never pay more than $50 for a league. Like I probably wasn't the person for him to bring on. Now, what he didn't tell me was he's like, I'm really looking for a partner that's dedicated, that's going to be committing to this long term. With the caveat that he wasn't going to really make me pay for the first year. We were just going to co-manage, and, I get a cut if we win, but I don't have to pay. So it was a really cool deal. At that point in my life, I was not ready to drop what it costs to even split these teams. But we got started, and it was the best decision I've made because I made a lifelong friend. We're still going as a partnership this year. This will be our 8th year going to Las Vegas. We usually do like 10 live drafts a year. We're to the point where we've won enough to where we can do a ton of leagues, probably 50 leagues across different places. But we always meet up for a couple weekends a year and draft. We split up. We usually draft differently, so we get a nice variety of, if we're drafting 50 teams, I'll draft half, he'll draft half. So we get different ways because we totally build teams differently. We have different philosophies, but it works well because we trust each other, and we're willing to essentially say, okay, Kacey, you're going to draft some, I'm going to draft some, you're going to manage yours, I'm going to manage mine, but we're co-invested in everybody's leagues. So this is our 8th year. We have always kind of come out on top and had enough money to roll over and play again and play more. So that's my experience live drafting. I've done some other random ones, like at the Expo and, random live drafts. I've never done an SFB draft live. I've been meaning to, but I've just never been worked out date and location wise. But yeah, live drafts, especially when you're with people, like a place like the Expo or in Las Vegas is where the FFPC does their drafts. When you're there with a bunch of people that are kind of on a little vacation for the same reason, it's way different than even just drafting with your home league. Like everybody's there for that purpose. So it's business, but it's also really lighthearted and fun because, again, it's kind of like a vacation for everybody. So it is an experience. I would say if you've never done a live draft, you'd want to try it, especially if it's something where you can do a lot of them. That's why I love going to Vegas, because I know I'm going to be able to draft 7 different teams there. So like I can mess up the first one. You know what I mean? Like it's you get your comfortability, you kind of get a feel of how things are going, but you can go and do another one. So it's very, very, very rewarding to do that. And shout out to my partner, Jay Reed, who really brought me on. Like that has opened up a whole new realm of, people to get to know. And it's created a fun trip that I get to do every year, going to Vegas to watch opening weekend.
Yeah, that is awesome. That's so awesome to have that community. And then there's so many people in the fantasy football community and all these little pockets, and you find them in the different spots going to Vegas and then the expo and everything like that. What about Dynasty? Like, exactly how did you come across Dynasty? When did that come into your life and how did that happen?
Ooh, yeah. So I said I started playing like around 2012, 2013. But when I say started playing, like that's when I started my first Dynasty League. Now, I don't know exactly when you started playing, but back then it wasn't really the same game as it is today. There wasn't a lot of information. DLF existed back then. I remember watching some old DLF videos. I've done my time working for DLF, etc. But back then I even was like, okay, what is this DLF? And I had come from a time in my life, probably from 2008 to 2013, where not that I wasn't interested in fantasy sports or sports in general, but I had been, on another little life journey trying to figure out some health problems and medical conditions that I had. So I was really into fitness, nutrition, weightlifting. I power lifted for a long time. Like I was really into that side. So a lot of my free time was focused on that. So it was just podcast after podcast. You remember the prime peak for podcasts, where podcasts were like the new medium, to where it was like, wow, like a podcast that actually has like a whole episode. Now, like podcasts they are what they are. They're just an option. But back then, I all I did was listening to health and wellness and fitness podcasts constantly. And then I started dabbling into finding some fantasy football shows. And then you kind of have this podcast vibe that you're on. And I'm like, you know what? Let me get back into playing sports. You kind of get a little saturated with some of the stuff you're listening to. So it was really the early podcasting from DLF and from some of the other very, very early podcast platforms that got me into playing Dynasty. And then to answer your question, the first 3 years I played Dynasty was just haphazard, didn't know what I was doing, knew really nothing about how to value draft picks, how to build rosters, how to roster construct, none of that. It was just, oh, this podcast told me to like this player. Okay, that makes sense. So it's like 3 years of you are the one that's in the room and people are like, who is this person? Like, do they even have a strategy? And then you start to realize like there's more out there. You start finding the film versus analytics. And then there's more sites that pop up that start talking about advanced things like target share. Oh my gosh. Like that was an absolute game changer. You talking about things like target share and breakout age. Those are like, wow, like this might be the answer to everything. If I just know this, I'm never going to miss. So that leads into like 2017, 2018. I don't know if you recall old Dynasty Command Center that was started by Ryan McDowell and Curtis Patrick. They started a Dynasty Command Center. And at the time they were at different companies, but they started this Dynasty Command Center. And it was just a Slack group. It was a subscription Slack group that you paid $10 a month to be a part of. It was ahead of its time. Now everybody has a Patreon and, you pay $5, $10 a month to be a part of a community. But this was 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And it was way ahead of its time. And it was like Dynasty Command Center. And so anybody that liked Dynasty, they're just like, hey, I'll sign up. So I signed up. That really got me into, you start getting around like-minded people and they go, oh, how many leagues are you in? Like 3, 5. Like, well, I have another one. and another one and another one. So all of a sudden you're getting into 10, 15, 20 leagues, and you get around like-minded people that are bouncing ideas off of each other. And I spent a year in that Slack group every day, hours, responding to people, going back and forth. And then finally they were like, you know what, you're super active. You're one of our most active members, and you seem to know what you're doing based on your own anecdotal, failures and successes. Why don't you come on as part of our staff? And they were building kind of a team, which eventually became what RotoViz is now. But they brought me on, and they were just like, hey, do you want to try a podcast? Do you want to write some articles? Do you want to host this event inside the Slack group? And that's how the content creation started. But it totally stemmed from, I was just a player looking to get better because I wasn't very good. And then you get into that group and boom, there we are.
Hey everyone, Kacey Kasem here. I want to take a moment to tell you about Sunday Dreamers Club, my fantasy football inspired t-shirt store. If you're looking for unique, stylish, and comfortable apparel that showcases your love for fantasy football, look no further than sundaydreamersclub.com. Whether you're gearing up for the next big game, hosting a draft party, or just want to sport some awesome gear, Sunday Dreamers Club has got you covered. With a variety of designs and styles to choose from, there's something for every fantasy football fan out there. Your support means the world to me, and there are so many ways you can help me grow this new small business. Grab a shirt or two for yourself or as a gift for your fantasy football league mates, or you can spread the word to your friends and family. Every bit helps, and I truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening, and now, let's get back to the show. That's such an awesome story about how you got into putting out content, because that's one of the things that I like to hit on a lot on this podcast is kind of just how did you initially get started? And people who are listening to this podcast who are trying to figure out, like, how do I get started? Being a part of a community and getting involved is very crucial in order to do that. Like, just there's so many people out there that are like-minded, that have the same things that they enjoy. Fantasy football is something that we all enjoy. And just to hear that story about how you got brought on, I love it when I hear those stories. Like, it's just great to hear that. Had you ever had any experience behind a microphone or in front of a camera, or even with writing? Had you done any since college, or how did that go?
Not really. I did join, so my actual career, I did join Toastmasters in 2015 for my job, but had no intention of ever putting it to use for podcasting or for YouTube or anything like that. So I had been part of that, which really, anybody that's interested in becoming better behind a mic or a better public speaker, anything like that, I would encourage you to look into a Toastmasters club that's local to you. It really can help with kind of squashing some of the nerves that you have when you're speaking in public or just being more social in front of a group. I mean, I was a true introvert. I always tell the story. I was scared to call and order a pizza as a kid. It's like, I don't want to talk on the phone. I have to talk with other humans, which is interesting because my parents aren't like that, but I didn't take that up naturally. It had to be something where I was kind of forced and thrown to the wolves per se. Because I found myself in a job where, I had a mentor come to me and say, when this job starts to get serious, you are going to have to do presentations. You're going to have to be comfortable with sharing material and doing it in front of, executives or leadership or even in the public sometimes. He's like, you should try Toastmasters. So that really helped me, I think, stand out amongst some of the other people in terms of, hey, do you want to try a podcast? And at the time, I was really into podcasts, so I was able to listen, and I still do. I still listen to probably more content than anybody you've ever had on this show because I listen on 3x speed, and I just listen to everything that's going on in the industry for the most part. But I was doing that back then. So I was able to take a lot of what I was hearing and going, not saying I can do it better, but I think it can be done in a different way. So that alongside the Toastmasters, and I was about 2 years in Toastmasters at that time, I was confident. And they're like, you know what? You want to try being on a podcast? Here's a platform. And then I go, you know what? I like being on a podcast, but at the time it was maybe only once a month. So I'm like, I'm going to start my own. And I'm sure a lot of people that got into podcasting, it started with, I'm just going to start. I'm going to record and see what it sounds like. And I have a little group here that I can share it with, and they will tell me, does it suck? Is the audio awful? Do you need to get a new mic? And then you get on YouTube. Do you need to get a new camera? Is your background like all those things just happened organically? I never came into this going, I'm going to have a podcast. I'm going to be somebody that people look to as an authority in the space. But that's how it happened. And from there, you know, it just grows. And I know you've been on many shows across the years. Like, it's fun to have those reps. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like to go on somebody else's show and be the interviewee where they're asking you questions, but then to also have your own show where you play different roles. I feel like it is just professional development to be able to play all of those different roles, go on shows, interact with different people. It really strengthens you as social person, as a professional, whatever you do. I think having those reps is awesome. So that's why I still do it, because it's fun. I enjoy it.
No, I get that. I'm still scared to call and order a pizza. Like, that's just me. And that's why I ramble a lot on here. I'm like, well, you know, that's just who I am as a person.
You don't have to anymore now. Like that skill, it's very funny. In Toastmasters, when COVID hit, it morphed from, because it is like a world-renowned public speaking organization, right?
Yeah.
But then when COVID hit, almost all of the clubs that were community clubs, like our club here locally is a community club, meaning we meet outside of a workplace. There's a lot of clubs that people will say, oh yeah, my work had a club that they meet at lunch or whatever. They meet at the office that we're all in. But a community club is just people from the area that you live. Mm-hmm. And COVID shot all of that down.
Yeah.
Like, you're not allowed to meet where we typically meet. We meet at a public library. Like, you weren't allowed to go there. So what do? And so we had to shift to like, okay, do we want to start doing it over Zoom? Which, that's a different skill, right?
Yeah.
Being Zoom versus being in person is a different skill. Being on a podcast versus speaking at the expo on a panel is a different skill.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's weird. You come out of COVID and it's kind of morphed. Like, what do people want now? We get people that come into our club and they say, do you guys teach Zoom presentations? Because that's all my job is. I want to become more confident, but really what I want to learn is to be better presenting not in person.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of been weird over time, but I think the biggest benefit is just the confidence you get of being in front of people, being in front of a crowd. That will never go away. Every time I've done thousands of speeches in front of groups, I still get nervous. You still get that pit in your stomach, like, what if I forget what I was supposed to say?
Yeah.
Or what if something happens that I wasn't ready for? Like, you still get that, but putting yourself to that challenge every time you're about to do a show, do a podcast, even record your own shows. I'll record a solo video show and you get those nerves before you hit record. And then once you go, you're fine. But I think challenging that kind of thing in life is huge.
Yeah. I always forget what I'm saying, even like mid-sentence. So I do need to work on all of that. So, okay, starting your own podcast is something that is kind of scary. It was for me, at least. Like, I didn't know where to go or what's to do to start a podcast. Like, how do you do it? I mean, it's actually a lot more. There's a lot more options out there now than there used to be. And you can put a podcast out quite a lot simpler than you used to be able to. But where did you start when you first decided to put a podcast out? And what should people do that are now trying to put out podcasts, don't know where to go?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because when I first started, the biggest challenge for me is, how do you start?
Right.
Now, there's a million places where you just download an app or you get something like StreamYard or whatever, and it's dummy proof. You literally just hit record. Back then, I had an old headset that I had from a job. And I'm like, okay, I have something that I can talk into, but you still had to figure out, like, where do you record it? What records a quality audio file? And then how do you edit it? Like, I was completely self-taught through watching YouTube, reading articles, like, here's how you start. Here's the components of what you need. Here's how you get it published. And then obviously there's other people out there that have done it, so you can ask their advice if you know they've started a show. But it was very much, I record it and I'm playing the wave file on my phone. Like, okay, what would this sound like? You know, voice recorder. I'm recording a podcast on voice recorder on my iPhone, just trying to figure out, okay, what would this sound like if I talk through my phone versus if I record on my computer? And then you start to learn how to edit in music and all of that kind of stuff. So it's very much just I think there's a reason for my voice to be out there. So I'm going to try it. Who knows how many people even listen at the beginning? I think that's huge. If you are going to do a podcast, I think the most important thing is to have a community of people that you can trust, people that already kind of listen to you or interact with you, to throw it off of them first. There's been many people like in our community, like even in Destination Devy, that have said, I want to do a podcast. They'll record a video, whether it's on video or whether it's a podcast, and they'll say, will you listen to this? And just give me feedback. And you might think, I don't have time to listen to that. But if someone messaged me and says, I recorded this 45-minute piece talking about my Dynasty team, like, I'll give that a listen, because I was that person one time where I needed the community in that Dynasty Command Center to say, hey, I'll check out your show. And that's how it grew. Like, it really grew organically. And I think that's where you find staying power with the show, when you have people that already are willing to give it a try and support it and help you be better, versus if you have no social media following, you just pop up and you go, I'm going to start a podcast. I mean, let's be honest, Casey, if you see somebody tweet out a show and you don't even follow that person, you have no clue who they are, how likely are you to listen to that 30-minute podcast?
Probably not that likely.
Probably not very likely. And that's no shade to them. It's just there's so many out there. It's like,
right.
You don't have time for everybody that is trying to do something now to listen to it. That's why I think it's important to find your place, like find your community. Right. Let them tell you if you have potential. They'll tell you, like, they'll be honest, because you're not going to take it personally necessarily, because you trust them. Hey, try this. Hey, you can clean up your audio. Maybe you can try this, or maybe present it like this. Like, get that feedback. And I think the sky's the limit once you find your groove, because it's very enjoyable. I always say in Toastmasters, the beautiful thing about talking about stuff that you like, it comes naturally. If I said, give me a 5-minute speech on something you have no clue about, you'd be going, well, if I say, tell me 5 minutes about your favorite team or your favorite hobby or just about you, most people can just rattle for 5 minutes about their life, their family, what they love to do. It comes natural. We're all natural presenters or speakers. It's the content part and trying to fit it into a certain bucket is where you start to struggle, and you want to become a better speaker then.
How do you come up with what you're going to write about or talk about or present out there to the public, especially when you first got started? Like, how are you coming about those ideas?
That's a good question. For me, a lot of it, the one benefit that I've had is I was a Dynasty player and a content consumer before I became a content creator. So I was able to organically, my old show was called Dynasty and Chill. I did that for about 3 years. I think we had like 150 episodes. My first probably 10 to 20 shows were me just talking about what I was doing. It was when I really had no following outside of our Dynasty Command Center community. I really didn't even have guests. It was just, what am I doing? So I would do little projects like track ADP within all of my leagues and talk about like my portfolio and who I was trading away and who I was buying, and little nuanced strategies that if I went back and listened to those, I would be like, wow, these were so basic. But it was just me talking about what I was doing. And there wasn't a lot of that out there at the time. There was a lot of like, this player's good, this player's bad, but there really wasn't anybody in the space saying, I'm in 25 Dynasty leagues. Here's how I'm managing the 25. Here are the types of trades I'm trying to make. Here are some of the decisions I'm trying to navigate across a lot of these leagues. And that's what people originally kind of knew me as, was a portfolio person that played a lot of volume of leagues. So my strategies naturally became more macro strategies, right? If I have 50 leagues, I'm not going to care as much about individual players. I'm going to care more about like the macro roster building, trade strategies. And that's where kind of like the community that I built started to grow. We took that angle of a bunch of portfolio players, started to view the game differently than a lot of other content creators out there. I think that's a huge thing, is if you're going to start something up, you almost have to find something that other people are doing and go beyond that, or go the opposite of that. Now, you may not be right or wrong, but I think that's what people are more attracted to. It's like, oh, okay, there's a lot of stuff out there. The shows this summer where they just are releasing their top 24 Dynasty receiver rankings, like God love a lot of shows. But if that's the title of your show, I don't know how many new people are going to listen to it. A lot of people are going to go, hey, I like this content creator, but it doesn't really matter who their wide receiver 36 is versus 30. Like it's probably not in the grand scheme of things teaching me anything. And I already probably have my own opinion on that. So I'm just going to skip over that for now. So find something unique and just roll with it. Even if people listen to it and go, that's wrong, at least it's different. Somebody listened to it and said it was wrong. That's a win when you're first starting out. You're getting some traction.
Exactly. That is a win. Exactly. And I know like getting criticism on the internet is sometimes hard to deal with. And, you learn from things as you go. Have you had to deal with criticism anytime in your career? And how do you handle when people say stuff to you?
100%. We all have. I've gotten criticism on pretty much anything you can think of. It's my appearance, my voice, my audio quality. Somebody said one time that I passed gas on the show and they could hear it. It didn't actually happen, but there was a audio blip or something and it made it sound like it did. So like that out there, you're like, okay, that's not really feedback that I can learn from. I think the most candid feedback are when somebody tactfully will reply to something on YouTube or on Twitter or somewhere privately and just say, I want to know more about what you were doing. I want to hear your thought process behind this. It's not, you're dumb, you're wrong, you're an idiot, don't do another show. Like we can all read those comments, but that's not real evaluation. That's not real feedback. Nobody that's even critical of you is going to read that type of feedback and go, yeah, that person really, really knows what they're talking about. Like, I'm glad they told Kacey exactly how I feel. Like, that's not how most people would want to probably deliver feedback to you. But there have been people that said, hey, you make these statements. We all get caught up sometimes in our industry of referring to slang terms or things that we refer to, like the term roster clogger. I throw that around like roster cloggers. Don't have roster cloggers on your dynasty team. But I think candid feedback would be, hey, every once in a while, explain what that is. You just assume everybody knows. Everybody knows about this. Everybody knows about that. Everybody knows this term. Everybody knows what this means. But if you really want to grow your platform, that's something that Ray at Destination Devy and I have really tried to do over the last year or so, is not dumb it down to where we're going down to the basics. But every once in a while, you do want to put content out there that understand that as your community is growing, there's going to be people coming into this. They just started playing. They might have found you, but immediately what you might be saying could just go over their head, right? And that may turn people off from continuing to listen or continuing to buy in what you're trying to sell or what you're trying to promote. So I think it's just go back to the basics sometimes and explain what you're referring to, the foundation of what you're talking about. Because we get very much caught up in this fantasy football space. We assume everybody knows everybody. We assume everybody knows what happened 3 years ago with this, and everyone knows about this site or this platform. But there's people coming in, they don't know the history. They don't know where you or I were a year or two ago. They don't know the previous place we wrote content. They don't know any of that. This might be the first time they're listening to you. So I think just going back to the basics, but trying to ingrain that in your content. So the people that are really buying in, your community that's been with you for 5+ years, isn't like, Scott's selling out and he's just going to the real basic stuff. But also being able to work that in even in your most advanced content. It's a very fine balance that I've had to really kind of learn. Ray's taught a lot to me about that. Like if you really want to take it to the next level with your brand, you have to be able to marry those two. And it's more difficult than it sounds.
100%. Oh man, I love to hear that. And like, that is great advice from Ray. I love Ray. Ray's a great guy. And there's one of the things that my 1-star review says I do. I like to praise people way too much on this show. Well, Scott, I'm going to praise you and tell you that I appreciate your candid answers and what you're giving to us on this show. So, but yeah, you do have to kind of explain, like I'll have my wife read my stuff so she can tell me like, I don't know what this means. And I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe I should, All right. I get it. I get it. So yeah, as long as everybody can understand it, and I do, you do get the argument that you're dumbing things down and all that stuff, and you're not. You're not. You're just helping grow this awesome thing that is fantasy football. So keep doing that for sure.
It's funny you say that. So my wife absolutely does not care a lick about football.
Yeah.
Does not care. She has accepted it for something that I love.
Right.
But in terms of like the extent that she will watch it will be, it is on in the background and I'm watching it and she's just there, but she's playing on her phone or she's doing something else that is, hey, that awesome play just happened. Did you see it? No, I'm not even paying attention. But like that's the extent of her football knowledge. But that's perfect because I can sometimes show her a video or I can show her something, a tweet or something that I'm going to do, or she'll even watch some of our streams sometimes just because she'll see them on in the background or whatever. TikTok. She's on TikTok. She'll see our TikToks, right? Because she follows me, et cetera, on TikTok. Could care less what I'm talking about. But the feedback that I get from her has nothing to do with the content.
Right.
Has nothing to do with anything I'm saying. All of that she could care less about. She'll go, you weren't smiling. Or, that doesn't look good. Your background doesn't look right. Or I don't like his facial expressions on your video. I go, well, I'm not controlling that. But like that kind of feedback is actually valuable because it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It is an outsider that you're not going to get that kind of feedback in the space.
Right.
Your friends in the industry aren't looking at that stuff necessarily. They're going to be focusing on what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So it's actually really nice to have someone that is always around me that can ground me on some of those things. She'll hear me upstairs doing a show and she'll go, I really liked how you laughed, whatever you were laughing at. But she's like, it was organic. It was natural. What I could tell without knowing the conversation that it was genuinely you. Like that kind of feedback's valuable because you're not going to get that from your friends in this industry. They're just not going to see things, nor am I going to probably give a content creator that. If you send me a video of, a trade in Dynasty that you made, I'm going to be focusing on the trade. I'm not going to be focusing on like, what did your hair look like? How were you dressed? Like I'm not the one to give that feedback, but that's important feedback, especially if you're trying to sell yourself or sell your product or something like that. Like those things are what the person watching for an opportunity is looking for just as much as what you were saying from a content standpoint.
And so you were bringing up Destination Devy, and we'll talk about how did you get to be over there? You're a content manager over with Destination Devy. What exactly does that entail as well for those that are listening that don't know what being a content manager is?
Sure. So I've known Ray for a long time. Ray and I actually started at the very same place. Fun story. I won't tell it on here because it kind of goes back a little ways. It'd probably take 15 minutes or so. But I've known Ray for a long time, and Ray came into the space. He did exactly what many people know Ray GQ on Twitter. He came into the space, and he's told his own story, so I'm not going to speak for him, but he came into the space from a different lens, right? He was a fantasy football player. He consumed a lot of other content out there. But he said there really wasn't a name in the space that came from actually being a football player himself that was hardcore into the fantasy space. And he's evolved tenfold from then to now in terms of how he plays. But he got into the space and he was a different voice than what people were typically hearing from. So that helped him. And so I've known him for a while, and then we crossed paths at DLF for a while, and he had always been a part of my community. So we were friends. We'd done many shows and stuff together. We had never really like worked together in official capacity. And then he brought me on at Destination Devy back in early 2022, worked there for a little while doing a podcast, became very ingrained in his community. And then, we came around to 2023 and we really vibed. I mean, he's one of my best friends and we really, really vibed in terms of how our minds work, how we approach things. We're very much different, but also very much the same in wanting to solve the game, whatever format that is. We want to solve it and we're going to dig through the most minute details to try to figure it out. So he brought me on and essentially very much involved at Destination Devy. Shut down my own community to ingrain it over in Destination Devy. Really oversee all of the content on Destination Devy. I mean, everyone does their own thing, but the podcasting schedule, the writing schedule, the content creators, all that kind of stuff. And it's really just becoming a manager of the community. That's what we're all about. It's even less so now about the content itself. It's more about just building the community, building the tools out for the way that we want to play the game, whatever game that might be. But mostly just cultivating like minds in a community where we can go in there, talk to each other. I don't know if you have any Discords where they have voice chats, but there's a voice community. Yeah. And people pay a premium to be in there, but we are in there all day. So it's almost like a live podcast where it's just Ray and I talking through strategy in this or that. And it's become super fun. Lifelong friends made in there. That's what it's all about. It's really just about community and finding tools so people can go out and, find their own fish, make their own meals. It's not about me telling you what to do. It's kind of showing you the way that I'm doing it and the way that I'm thinking about it. Then you go out and chase what you want with the mind that works like that.
I love that. And go back to episode 6. I looked it up. Episode 6 is Ray Garvin's episode of this podcast. That was a very long time ago, back in
I listened to it.
Yeah.
I remember listening to it at the time, and it was very cool to hear some of his backstory. I remember that 100%.
Dad's favorite episode. So thank you, Dad, for listening to that episode at least. So, okay. Also being a podcast host, like with Dynasty Trades in 5, that is great, guys. All 3 of you guys are great. Can you go ahead and tell us how that came about? How did you start podcasting with those fellows?
Yeah. So aside from Ray, like I said, Ray's one of my best friends. Shane is also Shane's my guy. Shane and I are best buds. And Shane and I had just supported each other over the years in each other's communities. He had Dynasty Trades HQ. I had Dynasty and Chill. Half of our community was probably a part of both. And so we had these dueling group me chats that had, a couple hundred people each, but it was a lot of the same people in both. And it was Shane and I in both. I mean, there were literally days, Casey, where like we're talking about something in mine. Then it's like, hey, let's go over to Shane's and we'll just talk about it in there. And it's literally the same people. They're like, you guys are really posting the same messages in both chats when there's 75 of the same people in both. But Shane and I just become very, very good friends, very close. And then Clay, who's the host of Trades in 5, was a member of both communities. And he came to us and, you get to a point where a lot of people will come to you and say, hey, do you want to host a show or you want to come do this? But he must have sold us because he sold us on this awesome idea of Dynasty Trades in 5. And it was supposed to be 5 minutes a show. And our first maybe like 20 shows were 5 minutes. They were actually 5 minutes long. And it was just talking about individual players. And he roped us into, hey, that's a cool idea. What's that? An extra 20 minutes a month? That's doable, right? And then, of course, that morphs into, oh, yeah, we're doing 2-hour shows twice a week. And it becomes a lot more. But he sold us on this idea. I mean, Shane and I are best friends. So I'm like, oh, I get to host a show with Shane. Shane and I had never hosted a show together. I've had him on my show. He's had me on his show, but we had never hosted a show together. But then more importantly, like we didn't actually have to host. All we had to do is just talk and someone else would host. Mm-hmm. So Shane and I did work at DLF together and we did dabble in doing a show called Manic and Chill, which was just him and I getting on there and just talking like we were on the phone. It was very, very informal. There wasn't really a host. It was kind of me as the host, but like I'm not a great host. I'm a better color commentator than I am a host. So it really wasn't like a natural show, but people were like, oh, I love this. You guys are just talking hardcore Dynasty all day. There's no flow. There's no script. And I think Clay saw that and was like, I think I can rein these guys in and make a good show. Boom. All of a sudden it starts to grow. And there really wasn't a Dynasty show out there at the time that really was dedicated to the live streaming content that we were. And that I didn't think it would work, honestly. When we started going live every single week, like I wasn't sure we could sustain that until you realize that people enjoy humor, which I can be funny at times, but you put Shane on a show, you're going to get 3 natural things an episode where you're just like, I can't believe he said that.
Yeah.
But then
It's Shane.
he can almost say anything, and you know it comes from a place of like being genuine. So no one really holds him to some of the stuff that he said, because he said some stuff and you're like, damn, I can't believe he actually went there. But he's one of those people that can just get away with it. You know, Shane, you know, he can say things and you're like, wow, you said that in public. But then like other people would say those same things and they would be shunned. Shane is like, that is Shane. We love Shane. We want more Shane. So the community just built. I think we have great rapport. That's what keeps the show going. All three of us bring something different to the table. And we enjoy doing it. So that's how it came about, and who knows where it's going to go in the future.
Shane. And that accent, like, it helps too. You know, he can get away with more with that accent. So it's just, you know, we're just used to it. Shane, we love you. We also we love talking to Scott. We're gonna just kind of find some more stuff out about you when it comes to free time. When you're not spending your time doing fantasy football content, putting out things for all of us to take in, what do you like to do?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. I probably do too much. I mentioned Toastmasters. I'm very involved in our district leadership in Toastmasters. So I run a club, oversee a bunch of other clubs in our area. So I'm very passionate about public speaking, presenting, evaluating, learning different skills from a management perspective, because there's a leadership component to it as well. So that's something I spend a lot of free time on. I still really like to work out. I don't have as much time to do it as I did before, but I'm still kind of very interested in, you know, how you get stronger, how you become, you know, whatever it might be, adaptation. That it's that biology and that fitness background that I had talked about before that never goes away. Once you're deep into that, always trying to figure out like, how does the body work? So I'm still like, I try to go to the gym 5 days a week and just stay in shape. Not nearly what I was in the past, but just try to stay in shape. It's a nice way to relax. You can kind of be in your own element. It's almost a form of meditation in a way. Because that, between that, the podcasting, the Toastmasters, and my day job, I don't have a lot of time to just kind of sit and meditate or sit and relax. And you need that time. And I actually find that in the gym where I can just put on music. I'm not necessarily listening to football content. I try to stay off social media when I'm doing that. But that's a nice way to kind of relax and get into a different space than you might be. Other than that, I enjoy just spending time with my wife. We are cat people. There's been many times over the years where cats have invaded my live streams or my podcasts. We work for a cat shelter, so we're always fostering cats. We had up to 6 cats at one point. Very involved with the shelter, doing different things like that. My wife does TNR, which is basically like trapping and rescuing cats, getting them fixed, and then getting them so where they can get adopted. So we're big into that. So a lot of cat stuff. We don't have any kids, so it gives us some free time to be able to focus on that. So that, I would say, is another hobby that has nothing to do with sports or fantasy football or anything like that. Big cat person.
That's awesome. I love cats. Don't have any, but like I say, I love cats. I loved cats when I was growing up. I don't know how I would deal with them now. They're cute. My friend has a bunch, and we were over there this weekend. 4 cats. She's got a catio. She's got all that stuff going on. So, yeah.
When you find the right ones, and we've been very lucky to have many different ones. I mean, sometimes when you're working in rescue, you'll adopt one, and then it'll only be around for a little while. Maybe it has some sort of disease or something like that. Like sometimes there have been situations where, you know, they will pass on pretty quickly, but you start to realize that there's a lot of different personalities when it comes to cats. Like if you've never had cats, and I'll be honest, I was allergic to cats my entire childhood. If I went to your house and you had a cat, even if it's one of those cats that you never gone to a house and they have a cat, but you don't know it because the cat's hidden somewhere.
Yeah.
I'd be like, wait a second. I'm starting to sneeze. My eyes are starting to get itchy. Do you have a cat? Oh yeah, we do have a cat. It's upstairs. But I'm like, no, I can tell because I can already tell because of my allergies that you have one somewhere in this house. So I avoided them my whole life. Like didn't want them, didn't like them. But then I met my wife and she lived in a 600 square foot apartment. And she's like, I have a cat. I'm like, oh, is this a deal breaker? But luckily I kept going over there. I remember stopping at the store and getting like Benadryl before I would go to her house or her apartment just to make sure I could survive the evening. But then, long story short, she moves in with me. She brings her cat. 2 years later, we have 3 more cats. And all of a sudden, it's just like, I'm not allergic, but there's also just cats rolling in and out of our house constantly. So maybe it was the hormetic effect. I don't know if you've heard of that. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I've just exposed myself to so many cats that my body was just like, okay, I give in. We're not gonna have this allergy reaction anymore. Now it may be killing me silently. Something inside, you know what I mean? Like that allergy is just not manifesting itself in sneezing or itchy eyes or anything anymore. But it's like my body adapted to it. And so I kind of, it makes me question everything I knew about allergies. Like not saying if you have an allergy if you have a peanut allergy is to eat peanuts every day for a month.
No.
But it just has me questioning, like, okay, maybe allergies are not everything they say they are, depending on the severity of them. So yeah, long story, do not take any advice of what I just said if you have an allergy, but that's just my anecdotal story about how I was able to adapt to cats.
Exactly. And he could always just, walk away from the cats. Once you eat the peanuts, there's not much you can do. So
Correct.
Don't do that. Don't do that. Okay. Yes. So is there something in life, like a little thing that brings you joy? Like just something small that really puts a smile on your face whenever it happens, whenever you see it, whatever it is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say for me, it is being able to walk outside. And I'll take it a step further. I went through a phase of barefoot walking. People think you're weird. You're walking around barefoot. But we probably walked around a lot barefoot as kids, right? You didn't know any better. You're just like, I went outside. And I remember I used to go outside barefoot. And, my parents at the time didn't probably care much. Like, what are they supposed to do? I left the house. I didn't have shoes. Like, hopefully you come back without, cuts on your feet or, a nail in your foot or something like that. But we get away from that. And I went through a phase where I love walking. There's nothing better than a nice day where it's not too hot. It's not too rainy. It's not really cold or icy. You live in the Midwest, you're going to get all of those. But nothing better than like a May or June evening where it's nice and I'll just walk. I'll just walk around the neighborhood for hours, whether I'm listening to podcasts, listening to music, whatever it is. But just being able to walk. Like every day, being able to just be mobile. And then taking it a step further, being able to barefoot walk every once in a while. Like to me, that simple thing of just getting to walk for 30 to 60 minutes a day totally changes my mental well-being, everything. And until you can't do it, until you have an injury or you live in an area where you can't do that, your walking has to be on a treadmill inside or something like that, you don't really realize how much it actually does for your overall health. Your mental health is just as important as your physical health. So forget about the 2,000 steps you took or the 100 calories you burned. It's were you able to like level set where your brain is at so you can focus on the next day and the next day, and the walk does that for me. Being able to just walk even late at night before bed, I'll walk the dog for a mile. And that is huge. When I don't do that, I feel something is missing. And until you have something like that, you don't know. But that's what it is for me.
I'm so glad you said that. That is so awesome because, walking for me is one of those things. I'll go walk for miles if like I'm having a rough day. It's just it's so great. And walking and being outside. Not so much when it's like 100 degrees out, but when it's cooler, it's definitely great to be able to go out there and just kind of clear your mind. So we do need to reset every now and then. Okay, Scott, it has been great having you on the show. Like, thank you so much for coming on. I had such a great time getting to know more about you and just kind of hear your journey. It's been awesome. I'm sure everybody else who's listening feels the same way. But can you go ahead, just let everybody know where they can find you, what you have going on, and all of that jazz?
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure coming on. You have a really cool show here. I'll give you kudos for when you started this show. Like I remember I listened to the Ray episode and I had listened to the first couple when you first started the show because it was different. It's different. It continues to be different. You have people on from all backgrounds. And every person that you interview can probably teach the listeners one thing, even if it isn't, don't listen to me from the allergy perspective, right? Don't listen to me about maybe this or that. But I think you can listen to everybody's story and just say there's one thing you can take away from every episode and go, okay, even if they didn't tell you something or teach you something, your mind goes in a place where you go, wait a second. Okay, I can think about that in the context of my own life. So I appreciate you for having a show that is different. It is a fantasy football show, but it's not a fantasy football show. And I think you've done a masterful job at putting it together, and best of luck continuing to go forward with it. So thank you for having me on. Charles Chill FFB, that's where you can find me on Twitter. Really, that's just a conduit to talking about what I'm doing on other platforms, right? So Dynasty Trades in 5, we live stream on there. I have a podcast once a week on Destination Devy called Destination Dynasty. Ray and I have a show every Sunday night called Destination Chill. It marries Destination Devy and Dynasty and Chill. And that's just Ray and I talking. It's very much like Mannequin Chill with Shane and I. It's just Ray and I talking as friends. And we go in a lot of different subjects. So that's every Sunday night. And then all the other content I do is exclusively on Destination Devy Radio or on Dynasty Trades in 5, one of those two platforms, which is mostly YouTube, but there's also podcast platforms for both. So thank you for having me on, Kacey.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Like, for real, go check out all of his work. Destination Devy is amazing. The podcast, all of the podcasts, including Dynasty Trades in 5, all amazing. You guys together is just a great combination. So thank you for putting out such awesome content. And for all you listeners, thank you for listening. You guys are also awesome. Like, for real, here I go rambling, but really, I appreciate the listeners. Thank you for listening. Go check out everything Scott has to offer and come back next week for another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. And remember to stay rad.
Get real. Time to get real, everybody.